Hello and welcome to another episode of Parliamentary Conversations in the Commonwealth, the CPA's podcast looking at some of the most critical parliamentary issues across the globe. If you were to look at the CVs of MPs or parliamentary staff across the Commonwealth, then the previous pathways into politics might appear broadly similar. Experience in law, education, health, business, the civil service. What might be less common is a link with sports. In this podcast today, however, we wanted to show that the links between politics, sports, and the Commonwealth go deep. Our three guests today show us the past, present, and future of these links. For the past, we spoke to Matthew McDowell, a historian of sport from Edinburgh University, who looks at the history of the Commonwealth Games and the Island Games. To talk about the present of sports and politics, we met with Liesl Tesch. She's a Paralympic gold medal winner and currently serves as a member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly in Australia. And to look to the future of sports in the Commonwealth, we spoke to Dr. Lynn Sambali-Kicheha, who serves as an advisor for sport, development and peace to the Commonwealth Secretariat. We started by speaking to Matthew McDowell. So, given the fact that so much of professional sports nowadays is either regionally or nationally based in different kind of federations, the Commonwealth Games seem like a bit of an outlier in being based on a political union. Why were the Games initially founded?
Thanks very much. The British Empire Games, as they were called at the outset. We now refer to them as the Commonwealth Games, but at the outset we referred to them as the British Empire Games. Their first competition was in 1930 in Hamilton, Canada, and it's very important to understand that the British Empire Games were largely the brainchild of Canadians themselves, conservative Canadians who feared what they believed was the encroachment of American sporting culture. That included professional sporting meets that featured Canadian athletes in the likes of Soldier Field in Chicago, and it also included the increasing popularity of the likes of baseball. There was also a very specific construction of amateurism, i.e. non-payment for performing in sport as opposed to professionalism, that these organizers were keen to impart as a certain kind of Britishness, that we're performing in this certain kind of Britishness, but it's also a certain form of Canadianness.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned, say, baseball or some other American sports that these kind of Canadian founders were looking to almost counter through the Commonwealth Games. So what were these distinctive Commonwealth sports as they saw it, or what generally differentiates the Commonwealth Games in terms of the sports on offer?
Well, they would have said, you didn't start getting what you might call specifically British sports until much later. You don't see the likes of netball or 2020 cricket or rugby sevens until probably the 1998 Commonwealth Games in Kuala Lumpur. What you see with the 1930 British Empire Games is a specific construction of nationalism and imperialism that is linked directly to amateurism. Amateurism being, of course, the practice of not getting paid for sport. There's a lot. Now, we can, of course, talk about this being as an ideal that the International Olympic Committee was wedded to as well in terms of amateurism. And they, too, saw there was a lot of pro-empire sort of feeling about the Olympics as well, too, because obviously it discouraged regional nationalism. It encouraged the likes of Ireland to participate within Great Britain, etc., and all this other stuff. But what you end up seeing with regard to this particular celebration of amateurism is the whole idea that what the Olympics is doing in the 1920s, 1930s, accepting different versions of amateurism in different nations, is not really what's looking for. They want a specifically British conception of what an amateur athlete looks like. And they also set it within a specifically nationalist context.
Speaking of the Olympics and this kind of Empire Games, do the Commonwealth Games come out of these kind of mass events then as well, or how do they relate to these other mass events such as, say, the World Expos, like the Festivals of Empire, the Olympics itself? And, while some of these institutions might have disappeared, why is it that the Commonwealth Games survived in different guises throughout the years?
I think it's a very interesting question, Oz, in terms of why the Commonwealth Games has survived, because I'm not sure I've got a good answer for you. I'll come back to it in a little bit, but this 1930 British Empire Games in Hamilton, Ontario is not the first attempt to have some kind of imperialist framework for international sport. J. Astley Cooper tried to have an athletics meet in what he would call the Pan-Britannic Games in the 1890s, which were going to feature what we would now call, or what would have been called back then, the White Dominions: England, Scotland, Wales, and then obviously extending to the likes of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa. But this whole idea, you see a lot of kind of these empire exhibitions and such, even in Scotland, where I'm based, right up until the 1930s, which would have been the same time as the British Empire Games existed. To some extent, I would argue that in as much as the Commonwealth Games have managed to succeed, it is in terms of continual rebranding of themselves. You can't really rebrand an Empire exhibition, a Commonwealth exhibition. You have to, that's kind of denying what was actually happening here. Whereas if you try to do, whereas if you're talking about the Commonwealth Games, on the other hand, you've got much more of a clear progression from one form, the British Empire, into the post-war Commonwealth, and you can kind of make the illusion that it's some kind of different contest. You don't necessarily have that with a lot of the expos, etc., where that's the case. They are meant to celebrate Britain in a certain context, whereas this is a bit more of a liberal interpretation of what Britishness is. Certainly the first Canadians who started it in 1930, the British Empire Games, had their own specific idea of what Britishness was.
Right. Well, then, apart from this, I guess, general political expression or expression of an idea of, say, the British Empire or something a bit more liberal or malleable, as you had mentioned, to what extent have the Commonwealth Games served as a platform for expression either for the nationalism of the hosts or as venues for protest or for any other form of politics throughout the years?
I think it's important when we discuss what the forms of politics that have been allowed in the British Empire / Commonwealth Games. To some extent, it's about the power that the Federation has had itself, which is to say it's not all powerful in the same way that the IOC or FIFA is. We kind of imagine these big behemoths like the IOC and FIFA being the big arbiters of nationalism. And the British Empire / Commonwealth Games is a little bit different in that regard. Certainly, the politics of the Commonwealth Games is different in the contemporary sense. In a very British context, it's different because England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland are their own nations. And if we look back to the 1930 games, the 1934-38 games, this was intentional. This was meant to be a celebration of Britishness in which you could have your own identity celebrated within the context of the imperial family. So that already kind of changes the kind of dynamic there in terms of what the politics of the British Empire / Commonwealth Games are. Once you start hitting the 1950s and the 1960s, you start hitting the problems of decolonization there. Most notably in terms of apartheid South Africa, but also in terms of post-unilateral Declaration of Independence Rhodesia, so 1965 to 1980. Apartheid, of course, in South Africa was a very explicit form of racial discrimination and segregation. And what you'd have in Rhodesia / Zimbabwe from 1965 to 1980, and well before that, obviously, is you don't necessarily have that explicit codified form of discrimination on the pitch, but you've got different changing rooms. You've got different quotas for the amount of racial characteristics you can have on one team. So there's South Africa and Rhodesia and maybe South Africa in particular, is the big kind of political issue in international sport during the 1950s and 1960s. And what you start to see by 1970, the 1970 British Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, first time was held in Scotland, is that what would be called in South Africa non-racial South Africans, for mostly black South Africans in this particular case, leading the charge basically to say don't play with South Africa, don't play on any kind of sport. And what happens in the run-up to the British Commonwealth Games in 1970s, of course, in England, you've got the Marylebone Cricket Club inviting the South Africa cricket team to play. And the Stop the 69 tour movement is a big movement. It's led by Peter Hain, the future Labour MP, basically trying to discourage the MCC from hosting South Africa at all these different grounds, etc. That starts spilling over into the Commonwealth Games. And this whole idea that England was going to play an all-white cricket team from South Africa, basically the Commonwealth Games. South Africa wasn't a part of the Commonwealth Games. What you have is a lot of African and Caribbean and Asian countries in the run up to 1970, basically saying, if you don't actually call that tour off, we're not going to come to Edinburgh. There's no way we're going to come to Edinburgh. And the issue of South Africa rumbles on into the 70s and 80s. There was a boycott from Nigeria of the 1978 Commonwealth Games in Edmonton in Canada. And by 1986, you don't just have this issue with Britain or England communicating with South Africa. The other big issue by the 1970s and 80s is also New Zealand rugby willingly participating with South African squads. Well, but of course the problem is at the same time, Margaret Thatcher's trading relationship with South Africa was, okay, they're not really great people or anything like that, but it's just politics. They're anti-communist. That's kind of okay politics with us. So we're going to keep on trading with them. And that ultimately leads to the mass boycott of what you see in 1986 in Edinburgh, where almost all the African, Asian, Caribbean nations boycott. And if you ever look at the clips of the opening ceremony, it's practically a sea of white. So these boycotts were threatened in the Olympics. And you obviously had massive boycotts in the 1980 Olympics in Moscow from the U.S. and a lot of other Western nations over the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan, and you have the counter boycotts in 1984. But none of these, the IOC is vulnerable to huge nations boycotting it, etc. Everybody's got the television rights, so that's all that matters at the end of the day. That's where the money comes in, and that's where the influence comes in. The Commonwealth Games was uniquely vulnerable to it. And in some respects, the kind of what you see in terms of political expression, even now in the contemporary sense, probably, in the past 20 years, one of the big live issues for all sorts of reasons has been LGBTQI rights within what's called the Commonwealth. Tom Daley, the English diver, speaking out very much he's been speaking out very much in favor of LGBT rights. You can see that in the Commonwealth Games to some extent, because athletes have a lot more power in the Commonwealth Games, and individual states have a lot more power in a way that they don't have in the IOC or FIFA. They have to play nice.
Right. I guess that issue of vulnerability is interesting as well. If I could bring that to the present day, we've seen around the world in the past couple of decades for big sporting competitions, increasingly either cities themselves or nations are either retracting bids for, say, the Olympics or the World Cup, or just blocking them or vetoing them entirely. And for the Commonwealth Games, this has happened twice, where in recent years they've had to switch on short notice to British cities rather than the initial intended host cities. So why do you think that this has been such a structural issue for the Commonwealth Games in particular in recent years? And is there any kind of solution that you could see to this?
Well, I think in terms of solutions to this issue, Glasgow 2026 might have one. I don't know if it's a permanent solution, but it's one of the solutions that the organizers in Glasgow 2026 have in conjunction with the Commonwealth Games Federation is simply to have less sports, and crucially less team sport. this is an issue that comes up in other competitions as well, other of these smaller competitions, and you have to put the Commonwealth Games in that bracket now that have less prestige, etc. Hockey was the first victim for the Commonwealth Games, the 2026 Commonwealth Games. You need a lot of people on a hockey squad. You need a lot of pitches in different stadia, schools, etc. And that also means a lot of hotel space. That's costly. Well, you cut that off the program then. So it's worth noting, of course, that we're talking about Birmingham 2022. It had the most sports of any Commonwealth Games. This model just wasn't sustainable at all. 2022's Commonwealth Games, of course, was originally supposed to be hosted in Durban in South Africa. And you have, of course, other cities pull out of hosting the Commonwealth Games. And even in the selection process in 2014, when we had the first Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, the other candidate city was Abuja in Nigeria. And there was lots of controversy about why Glasgow got the games over Abuja. If you're talking about what might be the global south in terms of why they back out of games, there's a lot of factors at play there. There's one obvious factor is that, we don't have the money, etc. But of course, you would expect Australian states in theory to have the money, and they say, no, we don't have the money either. The accommodation budget, what we have to build for this in terms of facilities and accommodation is it's ripping off our own taxpayers for their other needs, etc. So then there's certainly a reason that both the global south and what you might call the global north are united in basically saying that they cost too much money. But there's also, in terms of bigger structural issues that the Commonwealth Games has, there is what I like to call an expectation of sport management issue. I work with students from all over the world, etc., and they expect sport management, sporting events to work almost frictionlessly. Mm-hmm. There's none of this stuff from a lot of students about, okay, we have to accept a lower grade of accommodation and we have to accept something more sustainable so that we actually keep this event going or anything like that. No, it's that if we don't provide this, somebody, Saudi Arabia, China, etc., will be more than happy to provide a much higher standard. So if we're talking about the Commonwealth Games, and games that have a very specific historical focus, etc., they might be big losers in the long run from what you might call the disruptors of national sport, etc., that are going to fund a more attractive product. And I'll even just give you one more example of this kind of this little bit of a pushback against sustainability that was quite controversial in Paris in 2024 in the Olympics. Adam Peaty raging about having no meat in his sandwiches and everything like that, going, I need protein. Where's the meat in my sandwiches? Why are we having vegan sandwiches, etc.? Well, in the Olympics, in the World Cup, they'll eventually just be happy to go to some country that's able to provide the protein that the swimmers need. So there's that whole kind of issue there too. It's the expectations of sport management. They just grow and grow and grow and grow. And in event management literature, there's this term called gigantism, the whole idea that the next sporting event must be bigger than the next. That's just not something that the Commonwealth Games can keep up with. And they have tried, and that's what's causing problems for both the likes of Durban and the likes of Victoria, Australia.
All right, interesting. To finish up then, I wanted to ask you about your upcoming book on the Island Games. Could you maybe introduce our listeners who might not be aware of these, what they are, and then maybe talk a bit about the overlap, both in terms of, say, the participants and then also in some of these longer term issues of gigantism maybe, or of logistics or of self-definition that they might have in common with the Commonwealth Games?
Of course. For those who don't know what the Island Games are, they too began in what we might call the Commonwealth / the former British Empire. They were the first inter-island games, as they were called back then, in 1985, were held in the Isle of Man. They were the idea of Manx parliamentarians, elected members of Tynwald, the Manx Parliament, as part of what was called the Isle of Man Year of Sport in 1985, which was a deliberate attempt at tourism development. The Victorian tourist tourism infrastructure was creaking. So we're going to move in and we're going to try to strategically hold lots of sporting events throughout the Isle of Man, throughout 1985, and a bid to do it. And of course, at least one or two of these Manx parliamentarians wanted to hold some kind of island Olympics that was based, one, partially on the status of their status as a member of the Commonwealth. So we're going to invite the Crown dependencies. We're going to invite the British Overseas Territories, but also our history as part of the Nordic empires, etc. So we're going to invite the Faroe Islands. We're going to invite Iceland. We're going to invite Åland, which is a Finnish autonomous region where everybody speaks Swedish. They've got a lot of self-governing powers. So it's this mix of Commonwealth polities alongside Nordic polities and a few others as well, too. And the Island Games has been held every 2 years since 1985. The 1987 iteration was held in Guernsey, and the one that we had just passed in 2025 was held in Orkney in the north of Scotland. And the overlap is quite interesting between these two competitions. You do have there are big athletes that got their names in the Island Games. The most obvious one is Mark Cavendish, the Manx cyclist. But you also have folk like Carl Preen, the table tennis player from the Isle of Wight, etc., who are also big athletes. Kelly Southerton, also from the Isle of Wight. So some of these athletes got their start in the Island Games, or they won medals in the Island Games early on. But the interesting thing about the Island, there are a couple of interesting things about the Island Games. There's one, obviously, that it's not like the Commonwealth Games in terms of you don't need these big stadia or anything like that. The assumption is that organizers and hosts basically place the games within the hospitality economy. So they don't need to build new facilities or anything like that. And every team that gets there has to pay for their own travel. So they've got to do a lot of fundraising on their parts, and that includes the likes of the Falkland Islands and St. Helena, who go through all sorts of different, creative fundraising opportunities and everything like that. I've got some amazing leaflets from the Falkland Islands of things that were done there to raise money to go and participate in the Island Games. They've got to arrange their travel. They've got to book their own hotels, etc. And from a host perspective, that's obviously very attractive. The hotels get money, and it obviously brings money in instead of wastes money on sporting facilities that may not get reused to the same scale. It builds it within the sporting facilities you've already got, which is very attractive. The other thing that's quite interesting about it is you do see interactions now between the Isle of Man, between the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, St. Helena, and Åland, the Faroe Islands, and these other kind of non-British polities, etc., that some of the leaders in the likes of, they wouldn't tell you to your face or anything like that, but some of the leaders in the other Commonwealth nations and overseas territories that participate inside the Island Games see to it as necessary that they need to do diplomacy with nowadays, because can you actually rely on the British state anymore? The British state, in terms of the Brexit referendum, in terms of its response to COVID, in terms of Liz Truss's mini budget, which is still a thing that affects prices here in the UK, and affects kind of the way we're thought of around the world. How can we actually rely on the metropolitan state to save us anymore? Well, we might do, but it really does help us to do diplomacy with these other countries as well. And sporting diplomacy obviously is quite an important form of how do we get to know each other, etc. And increasingly, you see the Island Games hold almost as important a place in the sport policy regimes of the likes of these countries as the Commonwealth Games would.
All right, on that note then, thank you, Dr. Matthew McDowell, for joining me.
Thank you, Oz.
Next, we spoke with Liesl Tesch, who competed across 5 Paralympic Games in basketball and sailing, and currently serves as a member of the Legislative Assembly in New South Wales. All right. Thank you for joining me. My first question is, have you always wanted to become an athlete? And if not, then what changed?
I was an athlete as a kid. Like, I was the sporty kids in the class who always chose to get out of class because I got in a sporting team, and so that was just a progression. And then I played rep netball, and then I was introduced to basketball. And basketball, once I learned basketball, I said, "Mum, I'm giving up netball." Played rep netball for school and then for university, and then in my second year of university, I broke my back and was introduced to Paralympic basketball and fell in love with that sport, and went on and was selected for New South Wales because I already knew the rules of basketball. And so a lot of people who end up in the Paralympics have to learn the sport sort of as an under 6-year-old, whereas I was already knew the rules, had to learn to drive the wheelchair, and selected to play for Australia. So I competed at 5 Paralympic Games as a basketballer and played professionally in the men's leagues in Spain, Italy and France. We played in the men's leagues in Australia till we invented our own women's competition, and did the Sydney to Hobart yacht race when I came home from living in Europe. Go to Miami to compete in a regatta, and we won our regattas, and I came back and retired from basketball and took up sailing and sailed in London and Rio and won gold medals. So it's just a journey. It's just a way of life, I think it became, more than anything else.
Right, yeah. That was something kind of natural or intuitive for you to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned Rio as well and the Paralympic Games there. You were elected as a member of the New South Wales legislature in 2017. So that's only a year after the end of the Rio Paralympics, right?
Yeah,
so,
and interestingly, there was no sailing in 2020. So in Paralympic sport, just like in Olympic sport, the sports become more popular, get into the games, and the sports that aren't growing get taken out. So sailing for people with disabilities wasn't growing, and so there was no sailing in 2020. And when I changed sports from basketball to sailing, I joined the Labor Party because athletes are really selfish, and I wanted to give back to my community, and I wasn't training at nights anymore, and I never really imagined being a member of Parliament. I had no sailing anymore, and Cathy Smith, who was a previous member of Parliament's leader, came to say she was resigning. I think I intuitively knew that my life was going to change because I had all this time on my hands and that crazy focus that athletes have, and I had a new thing to focus on. And here I am, a member of the New South Wales Parliament. And I'm pinching myself that I've been a Paralympic athlete, I've got medals, and I still pinch myself that I'm a member of Parliament.
Great. And what was that kind of sudden transition like then as well? I guess it wasn't all that sudden if you were involved in the Labour Party for the years leading up to the election, right?
Yeah, I joined the party in 2014, but as I said, I wasn't really, my life goal was definitely not to be an MP, but I think having taken on challenges, learning to play, being an able-bodied young person and then becoming a paraplegic and taking on a new life in that form gave me some skills that, yes, I can do stuff. I'd set up an aid organisation on the side, so I was sort of passionate about creating stuff that makes the world a better place. And then I think also having that change from playing in Australia and then living overseas, I can take on these new challenges, and then once again changing from wheelchair basketball to sailing, which is a complete different shift. I remember going down to our Institute of Sport trying to learn they sent me there to do the drugs in sport and the fitness and strengthening, conditioning and nutrition. I was like, I already know how to do all this stuff. I'm an athlete, but I'm just changing sports was another thing, saying, hey, Liesl, you can take on the next challenge. So I think probably it was really the next challenge. And I had an amazing state senator really took me under her wing and took me on the journey as well. And I think also when the Labor women came to door knock beside me, I was probably the feminist and the activist and the advocate for people with disabilities as well. When the Labor women came, oh, these are my people. And there I was on the journey. Still, there I was a candidate. Oh my goodness, I've got posters up around the community.
Yeah, slightly surreal of a change.
Yeah.
How has sport affected your approach to politics then, or to leadership generally?
I think it was an evolution in sport to become a voice for people with disabilities, on a broader scale than just sport as well. And then I was the player on the team, admiring those players who are older and wiser. And then all of a sudden I am the older and the wiser player that are taking those young kids and mentoring them under my wing. And that's been the journey onto sailing. I was just a wise person. I had to do the self-discipline to get there. And so then the opportunity to get into the Parliament is I don't know. I can. I don't know. I've got this voice. I've got this confidence. I've got a life experience around me. And so that was, I can put my hand up, and I still can't quite believe that I'm here.
I think, speaking of mentoring as well, one of the programs that you've established is the Beyond Sport mentoring program through Paralympics Australia. So could you just tell our listeners a bit about how the program works and what the initial inspiration was for founding this program?
I think the importance of role models and mentoring for me as an athlete has been really crucial to my personal development, but I just know the roles that I've played there. And so I had this dream in my head about a Paralympian mentoring program. And when COVID arrived, we had all this time when we weren't out in the community as an MP. So I wrote a curriculum and I roped in one of my girlfriends, and we ran a couple of pilots. And initially the dream was to do it flying in people with disabilities and guide dogs, and food allergies was so complex. But over Zoom, it turned into this amazing national program, and we ran a couple of pilots and then realised, hey, this is really important, and it's older and experienced athletes supporting young and upcoming athletes, and we're doing cross-gender, cross-sport, and we found it really, really positive, embedded as part of Paralympics Australia, and it really is. We're now linking into corporate organisations about employment, so it's about supporting these young athletes to be not only great athletes but better human beings and better corporate citizens, and linking them in other opportunities beyond sport. And so it's now called the Beyond Sport Mentoring Program, and it's real. So I think taking something from a dream into reality whilst you're still being an MP on the side and seeing that success has been, I don't know, I don't have time to think about lots of those things, so it's nice to reflect on that every now and then.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think the other program as well that you've had an instrumental role in founding was Sport Matters. So it's an organization that combines sport and play with other non-sport outcomes to achieve specific development goals around the world. So what made you want to found this program? And in your view, what's that kind of link between sports and development more generally? Because it's not the first thing that many people would think of when looking at development assistance or development aid.
Yeah, I think sport is Nelson Mandela said sport has the power to change the world. And I think we actually saw that in South Africa, in the voice of influence, and sport is so important. And as an Australian, sport's so incredibly important, but also as a geography teacher, I used to do lots of travelling, and my passion is about development geography. So I'd go to developing nations and you'd meet people with disabilities, and then all of a sudden I'm in Bolivia and I'm at the National Wheelchair Basketball Championships, and because I've got my old wheelchair, which is better than all their wheelchairs put together, I'm the referee and I'm the coach, and then I realise the boys take off their singlets at the end of the game, get out of their wheelchairs, the girls put on these sweaty singlets and get into the sweaty wheelchairs, and think, hey, life could be a bit better. And then I did a couple of volunteer projects in Africa and realised we can do this on a larger scale, because bringing people with disabilities in particular together as a community, where people with disabilities a lot of the time in developing countries don't realise they have the right to access sport, and sport hasn't been an option for them. Individuals and uniting communities for social change, and then having conversations beyond the community about access to equipment and access to stadiums, and then God forbid, access to jobs and employment and education and all those health. I think you're much more powerful advocating as a group of people. So I think Sport Matters now, we are still travelling the world talking about the importance of policy for inclusion of people with disabilities in schools, in sport, in councils, in communities, on an individual level, but also at a more large-scale social level for the change that benefits from people working together for change.
Is there a particular project, either through Sports Matters or through Beyond Sport, that you're particularly proud of, or where you've seen that change from initial inception to outcome?
Well, going to South Africa and getting people with disabilities who eventually were employed on council in Mitchell's Plains, I really hope to be back there later this year with the CPA and actually make contact to see what has changed as a result of people with with people with disabilities being employed, and also through the Paralympics, as Paralympic Australia and the Beyond Sport movement, having large corporate organisations now having conversations with us about how they can frame and include people with disabilities in employment is super important. I think in some ways we're role modelling in the private sector what we can be doing in government and sharing together resources. I think that will be a future step, sharing resources about how we're getting this to work well.
Great. And then my final question is, so you've been involved with the Commonwealth and with the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association ourselves specifically for several years. How has your kind of experience in international sporting events informed this international approach to politics?
It's just my passion. And I think the beautiful thing about politics is that you start off and you're like at the beginning, you're such a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed youngster in politics, no matter what age you get in there. But then you realise in politics you go on a journey, you bring all your background with you, but you also go on a journey of your passion. And my passion has been international development. So to be part then of the Commonwealth Parliaments and be part of conversations about a bigger picture about international development, but also about the importance of including people with disabilities in our parliament is so crucial. And I think being there in the wheelchair in the New South Wales Parliament has pushed not only for the physical changes in the Parliament, but also the intellectual changes of inclusion. I think doing that, there's still only a few of us with physical disabilities in the CPA. And so us being there, sitting at the table making decisions about our lives, but also pushing other parliaments to be more inclusive and be more inclusive in political parties and getting people with disabilities at the table as leaders is crucial. So I think CPA is doing a sterling job, including us. And I'd love to say we've achieved a million by squillion things. And I know we're physically making the parliaments more accessible, but I think the conversations we're having and the role modelling that is occurring is something that we won't actually, it's difficult to see the tangible changes, but I'm sure we're making changes that will impact parliaments around the Commonwealth in the future. And it's a joy to be part of that.
Finally, we spoke to Dr. Lynn Sambliki-Cheha, who serves as an advisor for sport, development and peace at the Commonwealth Secretariat. The first question I wanted to ask was, how can sport be used to connect young people with Commonwealth institutions? And why, in your opinion, is that connection important today?
Thank you so much, Oz, for having me and the wider team on the call today, on the podcast today. It's really lovely to be here. So just straight into your question around how can sport be used or positioned as a strategic enabler or as a link to young people? I would say that sport is a highly impactful and a low-cost tool. It's one of the Commonwealth's strongest convening elements and has served as a strategic enabler for inclusive, resilient and sustainable developments across our 56 member countries. In terms of how, it's seen as a high convening tool, but it still remains highly underutilized for a number of reasons. I think there's a disconnect between policy and practice, or between what is modeled at the grassroots level and what feeds up to the elite level of sport. And that's something that should not be treated in isolation. And another thing that we find is that sport is truly valued. Its intrinsic values is seen across other broader social policy areas such as health, education, youth, gender equality, and economic development. But then sport sometimes is treated in isolation rather than being seen as a cross-cutting tool for development. And so part of our work and why we exist is to bridge that gap, is to bridge ministries of sports with ministries of health and ministries of youth. It's to ensure that youth voice is not only not tokenistic, but really is fed in the process, that youth perspectives are included, because for the Commonwealth, 60% of our population is under the age of 30. And that's a very huge demographic. And we take that really seriously in terms of bridging young people and Commonwealth institutions. If I may continue, we found that in a post-COVID context that this role became even more critical, especially when there was a rise in youth unemployment and disengagement. We found that sport provided a pathway back into education, whether that be non-formal or formal. Sport offered that safe space for skills development, and it also offered those opportunities for employability as well.
Great. And I think that's really interesting how you talked about of linking up these different areas that sport might have an impact on, or these different kind of governmental institutions that might not, necessarily work together through a sports lens. So I want to ask on the back of that, how have you seen sport act as a driver of development, and what are some of the real impacts that you've seen on some local communities?
Very, very, very good question. So I'll examples that I've seen are, for example, one of our core partners is Team Up Australia, and a lot of the work that they do includes storytelling and folklore, and also embedding sport for development and peace programs with young people and communities in the Pacific region. And I could, if I went region by region, there's some very clear illustrations of where sport has served as a safe space or as an anchor for development. In South Africa, there's Waves for Change, which not only teaches life skills around swimming, but also offers those opportunities in South Africa for young people to, evaluate what opportunities for employment and employability are available for them. In Kenya, there is Box Girls Kenya, which really looks at addressing violence, reducing violence against women and girls, and using boxing as a medium to empower young people and empower young girls in particular, and young women and girls with boxing skills, but also offering spaces for education and empowerment. There's also the Moving the Goalposts that's out in Kilifi that speaks more broadly to reproductive rights, and also to how engaging in football or in netball, but primarily football for MTG is useful as a tool for empowerment and those wider non-sporting outcomes around reducing non-communicable diseases, their health and well-being. And so we see a number of cases, a number of very proactive, very creative sport for development and peace initiatives that take place across the Commonwealth that are right on target on the topical areas, on the issues that are affecting young people. For example, even with mental health and well-being, and sport being used as a space for recovery from trauma, or that really speaks to that wider non-sporting outcomes, those goals that are so important. And having served as a practitioner, was a coach initially in the first instance, and then moving into academia, and then now being in this really important and impactful position within policy with the Commonwealth Secretariat. There's that whole continuum around where sport has served as a medium for hope, as a medium for continuity, and now increasingly we find in the policy space for investment. And so that's a key priority area for us in alignment with our strategic plan.
You mentioned the Commonwealth Secretariat there. You were one of the authors of the Secretariat's Global Baseline Report on the impact of sport on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So how did you approach measuring some of these impacts that you were just speaking about, and what was the process of making this report, and then what were some of the key findings that came out of it?
So, embarking on that, come 2020, we published this global toolkit, this Commonwealth-led toolkit that had inputs from over 250 stakeholders across the sport for development and peace ecosystem, or the sector. And UNESCO being one of our key partners, but we also had all the regional bodies that make up the Commonwealth being present in that process. We also had groups of friends from the sport for development and peace sector also input into what would this measurement framework look like. And once that was published, the next step, or the next logical step, was then to test it. And so a steering group was set up with by guidance of the Commonwealth Secretariat and UNESCO and the WHO and other key partners to really test. And I must mention also UNDESA, which is the UN Development System as well. We collaborated then and said we need to be able to test this baseline. We need to be able to establish a baseline because this has not been done before. And we were rather ambitious and decided let's have a global baseline that really speaks to 7 domains of impact. And then that this would cut across and really showcase where is sports really making a difference. So we looked at health and well-being, SDGs 3 and 11. We looked at education, SDG 4. We looked at economic growth and employment, which was SDG 8. We looked at reducing inequalities as SDG 10. Gender equality, SDG 5, and strong institutions and partnerships, which is SDG 16 and 17. And this created, what's really exciting about this report is when we started, we worked with data custodians, but we realized that sometimes a lot of the data doesn't filter through, and that there's a missed opportunity there to really capture what's happening organically at the community level, but also at the country level, and working with national statistic agencies. So these are some of the recommendations we've put forward. But what we found, if I may, Oz, was that for health and well-being, Singapore ranked highest in the Commonwealth for sports contribution to health, well-being, and sustainable cities and communities. So that says a lot around movement, well-being, in alignment with the WHO's guidance around physical activity and health as wealth. In education, Jamaica led globally in providing consistent policy implementation, providing that specialist PE approach and teachers who could then work across primary and secondary school levels and even tertiary levels, because we tend to lose a lot of young people and communities when they finish off with high school. And then we also see that Trinidad and Tobago and Samoa ranked 2nd and 3rd worldwide when it comes to education and how that links in with sport for development and peace. On the economic side, Malta ranked highest on this report across the Commonwealth for their global contribution to sport, their Commonwealth-specific contribution to sport and economic growth and productive employment. But what was important, as I said, there was a caveat here, because in the methodology we had the baseline, we had data from, we went longitudinal, so we went from 2016 and what was available all the way through to 2024, 2025, and what had been put out there by member countries, by data custodians, by various group of friends that we knew and work that was continuing, and established a methodology that could forecast what is possible or where are the challenges. So it kind of creates that linear mapping of what opportunities are there, what it could look like in a projection sense. And we've used similar weightings when we work across the Youth Development Index, the ranking systems for member countries, and really to position this Global Sport and SDG Impact Report as a conversation piece about what is possible, what is important. We are shy of 4 years to 2030. What are we doing about it? And when you're looking at reducing inequalities, Malaysia led across the Commonwealth in promoting peaceful, inclusive, and equitable societies. Gender equality, again, Jamaica ranked highest at the pan-Commonwealth level, but we also found that they ranked highest globally for advancing gender empowerment through sport, which speaks a lot to the society and how sport is valued. In terms of strong institutions and partnerships, Australia ranked highest across the Commonwealth in terms of strengthening systems across integrity in and through sport, policy outcomes, partnerships, and protecting the integrity of sport. And so really serves as a beam or as a beacon when it comes to these conversation pieces. So it was a really useful exercise because it's allowed us to look at how do our national sports policies then align to the SDGs. how do we not, as a secretariat, not just offer technical assistance, but really look at the broader structures of collaboration and what needs to be qualified or quantified when we are working towards the 2030 agenda. I must really, truly credit the International Platform on Sport for Development and Peace, which is this global hub that has all the practitioners across the sector and serves as a knowledge portal for senior officials, for coaches, for ministers, for ministries, to really understand the importance of, sports contribution to development, to the model indicators, and to any further publications that we do. They also are one of our partners, together with the Australian government, on this work.
What really stands out to me as well is that of global spread of different success stories as well. It's not just one specific region or country. There's things that different governments or ministries or institutions could learn from: Jamaica, Malaysia, Australia, Samoa, as you say. The thing I wanted to ask you about next was the link between sport and peace building, because this is another aspect of your own work. So what is that specific link? Are we talking about sport and peace building on a national level or on more of a local community level?
Thank you, Oz. So sport and peace building has been an undercurrent of the work that we do, but has really come to the fore in recent past. We, as you might know, we have a whole section that deals with the political landscape of the Commonwealth and what avenues are there for us to ensure further peace and peace building. And sport often is positioned as one of these avenues. We have the Commonwealth Peace at the Crease work that took place in the last strategic plan. We have colleagues within the social policy, youth and gender team who are working with partners to ensure or to further advance peace building opportunities, dialogues around with peace leaders and leadership across the Commonwealth, and really bringing to fore the importance of peace for a prosperous Commonwealth. And this ties in quite nicely, so thank you for this question, this ties in quite nicely with the Commonwealth strategic plan that really looks at the aspects of resilience when we're talking about democracy or democratic resilience or environmental resilience or trade resilience. If you don't have peace, you can't have development. So addressing this core value that is also tied into our Commonwealth values and our Commonwealth Charter is really important to our institution and to the work that we do with our member countries. And we also find now increasingly that we can't achieve this alone. We're committed to work with our accredited organizations, with our partners, and for us that would be Commonwealth Sport more specifically as we look towards the Games. So we have Glasgow 2026 coming up. We, not only is it that we'll have the Sports Ministries meeting on the 22nd of July 2026, but during the Games time, between the 23rd of July through to the 2nd of August, there will be multiple side events that really tackle the different elements of what is it to have sport for development or sports for peace. What does that look like for the wider Commonwealth? So it's just a really exciting time and a really important anchor to the work that we do, not just at the national or grassroots level, but really at the policy level. And really being careful to document how we're measuring peace, or we are promoting peace, or we are defining peace across the Commonwealth. So thank you.
Great, thank you for that. I think my final question then touches on what you were saying just there, and it's about the Commonwealth Games themselves. So in today's world where we've seen increasingly large-scale sporting events where a lot of countries either can't host them due to the cost or have to pull out at the last minute, what, in your view, is the continuing relevance of events like the Commonwealth Games?
Thank you, Oz. I'm so glad you asked me this question, because I couldn't think of a more relevant vehicle, front-facing vehicle of the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth family. You know, the Games in Glasgow represent a reimagined Games. They represent an opportunity for member countries to continue to step up and to support what is a very important bridge for young people. Earlier in this conversation, I mentioned that 60% of the Commonwealth's population are under the ages of 30. And sport stands as a highly effective, and I say that with broad strokes, but a really highly effective and convening tool, a low-cost convening tool that we need to capitalize. The Commonwealth Games are a friendly games, but they also represent the best of us. They represent an opportunity for dreams to be realized, for an opening platform for competitions for our Commonwealth athletes, who then go on to also compete in other international major sporting events, you know. And so looking at the Sports Ministers meeting, and in terms of securing the continued legacy and success of the Games, we are working very closely with Commonwealth Sport as our accredited partner, and with our host government for Glasgow, which is the Scottish government, and other partners now looking towards 2030. So India will be has secured the bid to host 2030. There's already conversations to host for who would host 2034. So you can see that there's that continuity, and recognizing that countries have seen the need to step up and to put themselves forward to ensure a more robust Commonwealth Games, but also a very clear bridge between policy and practice. The two mirror each other, and we found that we've found a really healthy middle that will support the Games both now and into the centenary Games that are coming up in India in 2030 and well beyond. So we're at a really critical point of reflection, but a very hopeful one, if I may add as well. So I hope that suffices. I'm happy to keep giving more information and guidance. Actually, if I may, there's once Glasgow was confirmed, or as part of confirming Glasgow in the last 2 years, there's a very key paper that was published by Commonwealth Sport, and we did have input to this, was the Games Reset paper that looked at what are the 5 wealths of the Games, you know, of the Games. And these 5 wealths looked at environmental wealth, cultural wealth, diplomatic wealth of the Games. What do they bring? Economic wealth, the socioeconomic wealth, and the social cultural wealth. You know, the Games bring us together, but they also offer an opportunity for us to consider from a policy perspective for the Secretariat and that convening, but also widely for the Games and for partners and for Commonwealth Games associations. How are we securing our cultural heritage? How are we securing what is unique to the Commonwealth? And how are we utilizing these strong pillars, this reset of the Games, to accelerate trade, to accelerate inclusion, social inclusion through sport for development, to accelerate integrity in the Games? And how is the Commonwealth, in its unique value proposition, providing these opportunities because we're nimble, and we're able to then collaborate to produce policy that will then develop people and then allow us to also measure that progress. So I think I'll sum it up by saying that it's highly relevant, highly useful, and very exciting in terms of, with this reconfiguration of the wealths and the focus areas, the future can only be brighter.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Parliamentary Conversations in the Commonwealth. To find out more about the CPA's recent activities, go to our website at cpahq.org.